My name is Charles Hernick, and I'm with Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, and we're a right-of-center organization that's focused on clean energy. Why? The reasons are pretty simple, and we're going to talk today a lot about economy, and David mentioned that in his opening remarks. National security is of vital importance, and today we have a good example from U.S. Army about how clean energy fits into that space too. But then, clean energy matters for the air we breathe, the water that we drink, and lowering greenhouse gas emissions for current and future generations. Talking about grid resiliency and power outages is not an abstract concept. We all deal with this, I think, probably on a more regular basis than we'd like to admit. I used to do a lot of development work in Africa and Latin America, and in those countries, power outages are a part of daily life. Unfortunately, that's not the case for us. But we shouldn't underestimate the importance of keeping the lights on and maintaining that power generation for the purposes of maintaining our economy, providing businesses the stability and certainty that they need to operate and be able to function. Power outages are annoying. When the salmon defrosts in the freezer, that's annoying. But beyond that, when local businesses are shut down for a period of hours or even days on account of power outages, that affects real livelihood. Small business owners aren't always rich folks and are working, day to day to make sure that that they can keep the lights on at home, keep their kids well fed, and for a lot of Americans that are right there on the frontier or living on the margin, that little bit, that marginal energy really does matter. And so we do need to focus on this. And you see it in some communities, and there have been storms recently that have knocked out power. But we also look at other parts of the United States, and particularly our territory in Puerto Rico. And there, it may be irreversible, the type of power outage and damage that has been suffered on account of a grid that wasn't resilient. And so today we will focus on that definition of resiliency. We're going to talk about, how much time and what are some of the policies that can be implemented to make this work better. Now, we're all here. Everybody knows what the current events are. FERC is undertaking a rulemaking right now that looks at grid resiliency. That was kicked off because Secretary Perry asked and made it apparent that he was interested in purchasing energy from quote-unquote reliability and resilience resources, to the extent that we needed to provide price support for those resources because they have attributes that aren't otherwise priced in our electricity system. There's probably some value to that, and we want to have a conversation about what that means. Obviously, that rulemaking and that proposal didn't go forward, but given what I just said about the fact that we do deal with power outages more often than we'd like, it really is on us as a community of energy nerds to really figure this out. And it's interesting because we are moving into uncharted territory. It's hard to think of an analogy about how our energy economy has evolved over just the last 10 years, really. You think about where we were 10 years ago. We were using 20% more coal for baseload energy generation. And the rapid shift to natural gas and renewables is not small. And thinking about where we were just 40 years ago in terms of vertically integrated monopolies, and that was the standard way of business in providing power in the United States, to what we have now where the lines are being blurred between consumers and producers, and people want more of that. That's a very challenging setup for regulators to deal with, for policymakers to deal with, and for providers to deal with. There's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the term resilience, well, we really do need to focus on what that definition means. And it's interesting for me, I was originally trained as an ecologist. And in ecology, the concept of resiliency is front and center in a lot of conversations. How do you manage an ecosystem? We don't need to get into the ins and outs of ecosystems and whatnot, but when you go from a simple system that we had 40 years ago, handful of energy providers, customers, single monopoly that manages all of that, it's a simpler system. I don't want to minimize the complexity of it, but it's It's like you're feeding your fish, right? You know, one provider feeds the fish, handful of fish, simple ecosystem that you've got in your little aquarium. I've managed to kill fish before. It's like, it's not always the easiest thing to do. But now we're looking at an era where individuals are putting solar on their rooftops, able to sell back power. Hydropower is taking a different form in terms of microhydro than it ever has before. And the trajectory for renewables is skyrocketing. And we need to be able to adapt our energy framework to this new distributed system of power generation and consumption. So the challenge is on us to really figure out what that definition of resilience means. And so I'll read FERC's proposed definition of resilience. It's the ability to withstand and reduce the magnitude or duration of disruptive events, which includes the capability to anticipate, absorb, adapt to, and or rapidly recover from such an event. Seems like a reasonable definition. But how do we measure success from that? And that's part of what I'd like to get at during this panel conversation. So we're not starting from scratch. We do have lights on most of the time. Overwhelmingly, we're in a good situation, and we want to make sure that we can keep on a strong resiliency track as our energy production system and consumption system continues to change day to day at a pace that's probably more rapid than any of us would have anticipated just a few years ago. And so we'll figure out how clean energy fits into that mix because it's what people want. So what I'd like to do next is introduce each of our experts here, and you have to bear with me because I'm really going to read the bios, short bios. And then what I'd like to do is turn it over to each of our expert panelists here to introduce their organization and how it fits into this resiliency conversation in terms of actions that they've taken recently or would like to take. And then I've got a prepared question for each one of our panelists. And then we'll take it from there. And as time allows, I'd love to open up the room for discussion and conversation. So first of all, second in from the end there, we have Blair Beasley, who's the Associate Director of the Energy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Blair works on electricity sector issues at BPC. Her work is focused on exploring the impact of federal policies through research and analysis. Blair's work has helped inform state and federal policymakers. The Bipartisan Policy Center is a nonprofit organization that combines the best ideas from both parties to promote health, security, and opportunity for all Americans. BPC provides principled, politically viable policy solutions through the power of analysis, negotiation, and advocacy. Right next to her, a step closer to me, is Zuleika Strong, Director of Sustainable Energy at the Copper Development Association. She supports policymakers in the development of energy policies and regulations, collaborates with manufacturers on the development of new technologies, promotes the value of copper-related solutions in energy-efficient systems, and builds partnerships with sustainable energy advocates. Closest to me is David Terry, Executive Director of the National Association of State Energy Officials, NASEO. David has worked with NASEO in a variety of capacities since 1996. Mr. Terry leads NASEO's programs in support of the nation's 56 state and territory energy offices. The organization communicates the state's views on virtually all national energy issues, including electricity policy, energy efficiency, market transformation, renewable energy commercialization and deployment, industrial energy efficiency, energy assurance, reliability, building codes and efficiency, and climate-oriented energy programs. That's a lot. At the very end, we have Jennifer Murphy, Director of Energy Policy and Senior Counsel at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC. Jennifer handles the association's energy-related legal and policy work before federal agencies and federal courts. Prior to joining NARUC, Jennifer worked for the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities as a hearing officer and for the legal division and as counsel for the Division of Regional and Federal Affairs. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us here this morning. What I'd like to do next is have each of you, in just 2 or 3 minutes, introduce your organization and what's been your recent engagement with grid resiliency, either as a concept as a whole or with this particular rulemaking. And Jennifer, since I introduced you last, I'll start with you first.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to participate here today. So I work for NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and we are the national association that represents the public utility commissioners in each of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories, which include the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam. And these regulators are the ones who take care of the economic and safety regulations for utilities. Our members are the ones who are charged with making sure that service is affordable, safe, and reliable. And as part of that, we have engaged on the issue of resilience and reliability and safety in many different ways. Most importantly, at the local level, each of the commissions are engaged at some level in ensuring the safe and reliable service of the utilities in their state. But we have NARUC is the national association, and we represent them at the federal courts and at the federal agencies. So we have engaged recently with the DOE NOPR. We filed comments with with FERC about the NOPR. Our first set of comments were, whoa, way too fast. You need to slow down. We need more time. And that was echoed by so many people. Needless to say, they didn't listen to us, but that's okay. And then our next set of comments, we focused on the importance of recognizing the role of states in this process and in reliability and the choices that they make, and that states are the ones actually responsible for resource adequacy through the Federal Power Act. And in other ways, we also engage in resilience through some of our other departments at NARUC. We have a Center for Partnerships and Innovation that works a lot with the Department of Energy, particularly through cybersecurity and other risk management opportunities. And DOE right now is moving forward with some programs on resilience, and we're involved with them on that.
So. Thanks, Jennifer. Blair, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me today. My name is Blair Beasley. I am an Associate Director at the Energy Project with the Bipartisan Policy Center. For those who aren't familiar with us, we're a think tank here in DC that actively promotes bipartisanship, and we work to address some of the key challenges facing this nation, including in the energy policy world. So at BPC, we have a long history of working on issues that kind of touch on the issue of power sector resilience, but really dove into this issue when DOE issued its grid resiliency pricing rule. We've hosted 2 public events that help to kind of unpack what key stakeholders, former regulators, and DOE officials thought about this proposal. The first one was in late October after the public comment period closed. And then we had another event after FERC had issued its unanimous decision to not move forward with the proposal, where we hosted Commissioners Chatterjee and LaFleur. So after hearing from stakeholders and regulators, we decided to kind of unpack a little bit what this term resilience means and to look at kind of the state of play of resilience, and issued what we've called a resilience primer, which is a short white paper you can find on our website. It's really a high-level introduction into the concept of power sector resilience, highlighting what work has been done to kind of define and operationalize resilience so far, as well as highlight what additional work is needed. So with that, I'll turn it back.
Great. Thank you, Blair.
Thanks.
Zuleika?
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank Charles for inviting us to be a part of his panel. Very excited to talk about copper and perk everyone's interest as to why, from the material side, we are part of this discussion. Just to give everyone a quick background, the Copper Development Association represents the entire supply chain of the copper industry. So from mining facilities all the way down to the fabricators and manufacturers of copper wire. And we do this with a lens in North America, but we're part of a larger alliance, a global alliance of copper trade associations, about 28 all over the world. So the concept of energy in the electrical markets is a very, very big opportunity for us. About 60% of all copper is sold in the electrical markets. It's a statistic that's pretty profound given the number of copper products that you see across, even in this building, from plumbing, sheets, architectural, etc. So what do I do for the CDA with respect to what we consider our sustainable energy program? Within this program, we really support policies that support the growth in what we define to be the sustainable energy markets, and we've grown that to incorporate renewables, energy efficiency technologies, electric vehicles, motor efficiencies, transformer efficiencies, and you can't get any of that done if you don't have the reliability and resiliency of the grid, and that's been our new focus this year, to make sure that we are part of the conversation and that there's an understanding about the role that we play. We are the most durable, malleable. I'm going to throw a bunch of adjectives at you. Conductive, and I can give you the statistics that support all of that. And within kind of the natural properties of copper, it really helps when we're talking about something as simple as having your systems work and electricity conduct in the efficient manner that we're used to. Because we're part of the global conversation, and as Charles kind of alluded to, there are a lot of my counterparts in many countries that deal with a lot of system interruptions that we don't really have that much here in the U.S. in comparison. And so we're excited to be part of the conversation, and we're excited to show and lend the support from a material side that what we do to interplay with within this industry.
Thanks, Zuleika. That's an impressive statistic that 60% of copper is in electricity. The rest is in Moscow Mule mugs here in Washington, D.C., I guess.
So enjoy, drink that.
David, if you want.
I may have disconnected. We'll borrow.
There you go.
There we go. I think one of the challenges we have is also understanding at the state level the roles of various players. And I think most of you are probably very familiar with the state regulators, our partners at NARUC, and likely less so with our members. They tend to be governors, energy policy advisors. We represent, as Charles noted, the 56 state and territory energy directors. The majority of those directors are appointed. They serve at the pleasure of the governor, but that also means they have a very economic development lens that they bring to energy, and a more comprehensive look. So electricity is certainly front and center, but natural gas, petroleum, renewables, you name it. And in this space in particular, the history of our organization and our members goes back to the Arab oil embargo. Energy emergency preparedness and planning has been at the heart of their work for many years. So in the area we are now, where energy directors are typically asked by their governors to do comprehensive energy plans, policy plans, come up with recommendations, resilience and reliability, of course, is more front and center than ever. And I think one of the new entrants in this area, not so new to many of us here, but I think for many of the states and many of the people dealing with evolving cybersecurity issues, the interdependencies across the electric system, the natural gas system, and petroleum are increasingly complicated. So we take a more holistic view for that reason. We rely greatly on our colleagues at NARUC in doing that. Our members typically have a limited regulatory role. West of Mississippi, they tend to have a siting role. But after that, it is largely policy. So thinking up new ideas, new ways to allow new technologies, energy technologies to enter the marketplace, helping the governor come up with policies that the regulators have the tricky and very tough job of trying to implement. So we tend to be two sides of the same coin in that regard. I think one of the things that we've seen in the last several years is the diversity of resources coming onto the system has really driven more of a distribution system discussion around many of these issues in most states. And I know that this has been set up largely as a FERC or bulk transmission issue, but I think the distribution system is really where we're seeing more of the activity, at least among our members, both in terms of reliability, interdependencies that are there, which are extraordinary, and as I mentioned, the cybersecurity issues. I would say regarding the grid study that led up to the NOPR, we made the decision not to file formally on the NOPR, but we were vigorously involved in the grid study development and input on that. We think we had some positive impacts there based, frankly, on the experience of the states, the good results that I think the industry, the regulators, and the governor's energy policy folks have made in this area. And it's more one, I think, of adjusting and making sure that the new technologies in the markets don't run over us. Rather, we catch up and make sure that we have take advantage of the diversity of the system we have. So I'll stop there and we can get into questions later.
Sure. Well, thank you, David, for that introduction of your portfolio, which is large, but also that clarification and probably the way that we do most regularly deal with the issues related to resiliency or power outages, I should say specifically, is at that distribution system level, not as the bulk power system is defined, which is all at generation and transmission. Having said that, we're having a big picture conversation for that explicit reason, and I think that that's probably important for us to think about as we're thinking about what our comments are going to be to FERC. To be where should that emphasis be, and I'm glad that you raised that point. One of the things that we're trying to do with this event is run the full picture, and I think that what you got from our panelists is that we do have important state level perspectives, and then as we move to the next panel for some of the technology providers, and then some of our local entrepreneurs that have energy efficiency and energy products that you can check out here. We're trying to have a lot of the conversation not within the Beltway, but thinking outside of the Beltway and what's actually affecting people on the ground. Having said that, Blair, you mentioned the two conversations that you did have with DOE and with FERC. What were some of the lessons learned from those BPC events with the regulator and with the federal agency at the table? What were some of the lessons learned that are important for this conversation? And I don't know if it's all in the resilience primer, and it's a good opportunity for us to look at that. But I'm interested in what some of those key takeaways were.
So I think, we're working again. I mentioned in my opening remarks that BPC hosted these two events on the FERC NOPR in particular and grid resilience in general. One at the end of the public comment period and one after FERC issued its decision. And both of those events really gave us an opportunity to publicly explore why stakeholders and regulators were both supportive and opposed to the resilience proposal that DOE put forward, as well as some of their ideas of how FERC should move forward. So just to kind of put these issues out on the table, we heard from several stakeholders as well as former regulators on why they thought FERC should not move forward with DOE's proposal, mentioning things like the need to clearly define resilience, the fact that they were worried the proposed remedy could cause serious harm to the wholesale markets, that they didn't feel there was an opportunity for meaningful stakeholder involvement, as we heard from NARUC, this idea that they needed to kind of slow down the process. An idea that the proposal could raise costs for consumers and potentially increase hazardous air pollution, and also that they felt the NOPR didn't meet the legal requirements that FERC needed to move forward. On the other hand, we heard from some stakeholders that they thought that resilience really did need to be valued in the wholesale marketplace, that they felt the need for market reform was urgent, and that they felt like FERC was the correct venue to start taking action. So a few takeaways, as you mentioned. One is this idea that we do need to define and get an industry-wide understanding of what we mean by the term resilience. It's hard to start proposing remedies until we know what the lanes of the road are. This includes, what attributes, characteristics, services we're going to include in this term moving forward. So FERC has done us a favor and proposed a definition in their new proceeding and are taking comment on it. I think that's really helpful. BPC has also tried to lay out what other groups have proposed thus far in this resiliency primer that I mentioned. So that's one takeaway. The other is I think this was a really charged process, definitely the shiny object in the energy world. FERC is usually more of a behind-the-scenes commission that people who work in the energy policy world, work in this industry, pay close attention to, but those outside of that niche tend not to. And this really pushed, the NOPR really pushed FERC into the spotlight. It did it at a time when there were several new commissioners coming on board we saw 2 chairs lead this very short process through. It was a time when FERC was just coming back to having a quorum. So I think at BPC, we were pleased to see FERC maintain its independence through all of this, move forward with a unanimous voice, which I think was particularly important in this case.
Thanks, Blair. That's a very helpful summary of what that conversation was, and I think cues this conversation up nicely to take the next step and think about resiliency, what that definition means, and what some of those attributes and characteristics are, as you mentioned. The truth is, we're not starting from scratch, and I think that David and Jennifer, what I'd like to hear from you is, what have we learned at the state level in terms of the policies that have been implemented to keep the lights on? What can we learn from the states when it comes to this kind of federal rulemaking? Is resiliency binary? The lights are either on or they're off, or is it a duration thing? I don't know. Jennifer, if you want to go first.
Sure. And I think one of the important points in this discussion is something that was mentioned earlier, was that a lot of these outages actually take place at the distribution level. Mm-hmm. And so my personal experience has been working for a state, looking at what's happening on the distribution level. And several years ago, we had, before Superstorm Sandy, before Governor Christie was looking at this issue, we had a few storms in Massachusetts, and we had one storm. And we went through the process, and we found, the department found that they couldn't actually, that the company had done a bunch of things wrong, but they couldn't actually be penalized for any of it because we didn't have the authority. So then the legislature gave us the authority. We developed regulations through a very broad stakeholder process involving the companies, and in getting them to start looking at, okay, now as people become more and more dependent on electricity, and as the scope of our economies change and how much of our economies rely on electricity, like every day, every hour that it's out, it's actually, the economic impact is much greater than it had been in the past. And we need to start looking at, how long is too long for something to be out? Are there mitigating circumstances? And one of the key things that I think we took out of that process, there was 2 things. One is that you need to know where your critical infrastructure is. And as David was talking earlier about Governor Christie, we found in Western Massachusetts, which is more rural, there were a few areas where if they didn't get power to the gas station, one particular gas station, they couldn't run the plows, which meant they couldn't plow the roads, which meant the trucks couldn't get in to put the poles back up, which meant nobody in the center of town could get power. And so it's those sorts of things. Or, where's the hospital located, and do they have backup generation? Where, what is their generator status? And so some of that it requires work to happen in the beginning. The other thing is communication. We found that a lot of the communities didn't have a relationship with their utilities, and that people needed to know who to call. A lot of times we have the situation where, people get upset, they call their elected official, they call the governor or the attorney general, they turn to the PUC commissioner, and they're like, what are you going to do about it? And we go back to the utilities, and they're like, well, we haven't heard from anybody. Well, there needs to be more communication at the local level. And I thought it was interesting. David and I recently attended a Energy Government Coordinating Council meeting, which is run by DOE and DHS. And at that meeting, I thought it was interesting that two of the themes they talked about were knowing what the critical infrastructure was, who has which lists, and there seems to be many lists out there about what's important to whom, and maybe there needs to be some overall coordination about these lists. And then also communication. There was a lot of discussion at the table, like, oh, really? You're working on that? Oh, yeah, that's good to know. Or someone shows up at, there was some example about one agency showing up at the scene after a cyber event, and the company was already over talking to the federal government because 2 other agencies had been there 3 days before, and they didn't know what information had already been collected. So it was standardizing the collection, and that was one of the things we did at the state level is we gave them templates for reports, and this is the information we need, this is the information. And then the other thing we talked about was communicating with the public. Like, people are much more likely to be less upset about a long-term outage if they can plan for it. Like, do they need to go get a hotel room 3 towns over, or can they wait it out for 4 hours? Like, and just that feedback loop, I think, improves response and resiliency. So I think critical infrastructure and communication.
Expectations are a big part of it. Go ahead, David.
I think building, from what Jennifer said, Sherry, your points are right on. And I have to digress for a moment because I was reminded in the hurricanes this summer about something that happened during the California electricity crisis, which was, I don't know what, has that been 15, 20 years? It's been quite a while ago. The Las Vegas airport ran out of jet fuel because the pipeline from California to Las Vegas was on interruptible power service, and people didn't really know. And that's, you would think we're past all those kind of, crazy events, but there are always those crazy events of one size or another in emergencies. Knowing the critical infrastructure and interdependencies becomes a huge issue. And I think, remarkably, the electric utility industry, the regulators in the states, I think, have done a good job of working through those issues. We've gotten better at it. But I think one of the ways we've gotten better is to dissect the load a little bit. So if we have mission critical facilities, whether that's a hospital or a nursing home, universities that are places of shelter that we've seen microgrids developed, and black start capability CHP units, those are different ways that at least our members are working from a policy and program perspective to address some of the reliability issues at the distribution system level. I think the actions taken around nuclear facilities in Ohio and Illinois and New York are another example. Those are done for different reasons to an extent, but those state actions, I think, are having a very positive impact in their communities, the reasons that they were done. I guess lastly I would say is we still see states of different political backgrounds, different parts of the country pushing ahead on, obviously, on renewable electricity standards, on storage. Minnesota, ranges from Minnesota to Hawaii to Massachusetts. Arizona's recent foray into storage is another example. So we're going to keep pushing forward on that, but I think it's being done in many cases in a little bit more thoughtful way in terms of the different types of load there are and the criticality of those. And we have a lot more work to do in that regard, but the policy direction that I see, at least among our members, is looking at those places where they know the lights have to be on or the power has to be on in a different way, a different criticality, and I think sorting that out will help a great deal.
Thanks, David and Jennifer, for those remarks, and I think a handful of those examples from the state level really do help illustrate, at least in my mind, what we need to be thinking about, or what policymakers need to be thinking about, because policy can be written, but you have to have metrics that either look at the outputs or the outcomes, and it seems that in these cases that you've illustrated, the outcomes are really more important. I mean, a kilowatt is not equal depending on where it goes and what it's powering, and looking at those critical facilities is of absolute importance. And so perhaps expanding on the definition of resiliency needs to focus on some tier of prioritization. As we look at that. So, I've got a question for you. And in the original Perry request, there was the request for price support. So, putting up the issue of cost, I know that you're familiar with Order 1000, and that kicked up the issue of cost allocation, and who pays for infrastructure investments. And when we're talking about it at this level, there are perhaps major investments that will need to be made. What are some of what's transferable from that conversation to this grid resiliency issue?
Thank you, Charles. I'm going to take off my complete copper hat and put on my old fur hat and my utility hat back when I was both at the agency and working for the utilities. I think that, and we've got a lot of experts on the panel, so please jump in if there's anything that I've oversimplified. But I think when you look at the way that the pricing mechanism and structure was set up for Order 1000, they're what was considered under formula rates. Reliability is under that. Anything from ancillary services would fall under that kind of reliability umbrella. And you're also looking frequency changes, etc. So kind of bringing this back to our initial conversation of defining what resiliency is will really also help set up that pricing mechanism and help the, at the end of the day, it's the RTOs, the ISOs, the states all working together to figure out, how this is all going to be encapsulated. And so if you are looking at pricing resiliency, and you guys, like I said, a lot of you are the experts, and some schools of thought and some thought processes is to include resiliency under that same type of line item like reliability is. If it is there to withstand and recover, it does really have similarity and characteristics to the functioning and the purpose of reliability provisions. So would we consider it an ancillary service? And if we did, then it's part of that and formula rate. If we're able to look at what types of generation we're going to have down the pike, or by we meaning RTOs and ISOs, then are we looking at developing this under capacity markets? Can we plan ahead for this? And that's a different conversation. The one thing I'll go back to under Order 1000, what I forgot to mention is that, within these formula rates that are, kind of, it's the rate mechanism, you make your filing with the RTO, ISO, FERC, you get your money. But if there are any type of extra incentives in building that you do, there is a separate filing for that under 205. And so now we're kind of in this new world of resiliency, which is new and not new. I mean, if you look at everything under reliability, making that delineation, that definition, having the RTOs part of that conversation, having the states part of the conversation, really will help determine whether we want to have a cost mechanism similar to what we have in Order 1000, or look at things and see our fuel resources and see if we need to do something a little bit different that would allow for additional transmission planning.
Sure. So let me just build on that real briefly, because you did use the term grid reliability and grid resilience, and part of what the last rulemaking asked for, what's the difference? And so I'd invite each of our panelists to answer that question, and it might be a short answer, but if you want to give us the first cut.
Sure. Well, I don't know that I give a good cut at the definition, except to say that going back to my earlier comments, I think the prioritization and how quickly you're able to respond in different to different customers and different customer classes, what on a personal level I'm willing to put up with, and what somebody on dialysis is willing to put up with are quite different. And so, right, taking that to a regional or national level, one of the things I would point to on resilience, where I think particularly good work has been done in the western U.S., defined as our western region, without drawing a map, it's sort of Colorado and west, maybe an easy way to think about it. There's a long history of the governor's energy directors and utility commissioners meeting, planning, thinking about what the governors are calling for in terms of policy issues, and what the regulators are dealing with, and what the various utility industry and grid operators are dealing with. That's somewhat true in New England, but it's not true in a lot of other places. And I think one of the things that Suleika reminded me of is just that discussion among those parties. It tends to be missing. So on resilience, I think we need to go down that same path, although I still contend a lot of it is at the distribution level. I think we need that kind of discussion at the broader level as well. Individual states have very markedly different plans for how they're going to invest for the next 30, 40, 50 years. We don't have the luxury of them making those decisions to last a year or 2 or 3 years. So I think on the resilience investments and the cost-benefit analyses, we really have to see around corners. I think the regulators have done a remarkably good job at that, all things considered, but we have so many more players at the table now. I think some of these discussions happening outside of the regulatory construct to arrive at a little bit more consensus around resilience needs to be done first, because these are contentious issues, and I think having the policy and the regulatory aspects and the industry investments that need to come together requires a much more focused discussion among those parties before it ever makes it to the regulatory arena.
Thanks, David.
Oh boy, that's a hard one to follow up, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I just don't want to say ditto. And so I'll tell you kind of a funny story. I come from the world of FERC. My husband comes from FERC. And so last night we kind of sat down, and my poor 8-year-old had to deal with that conversation of defining what it is. And so we're sitting there, and I'm like, well, it's look at the FERC definition. It's to withstand and recover. And he said, no, it's to recover. And I said, it's both. And then reliability is just simplified 8-year-old terms. The system has to work. And so that's kind of, I think that to simplify things and to, to put a little bit of my copper hat back on, from us, from a material component, we are seeing this grid as being the absolute backbone on the distribution end, on the transmission end, of integrating so many different markets and making sure everything works. And I think at the end of the day, whether you're talking about cost structure, whether you're talking about the system working and defining what is resiliency, what is reliability, you have to kind of go to those experts. I mean, even just sitting here and hearing really just the intent, critical infrastructure, security, does that fall into the house of reliability? Does that fall into the house of resiliency? And do we need to differentiate between the distribution and the transmission side, or at the end of the day, does everything need to work? And how we set that up, I think that the DOE grid study was a great conversation starter. I think it planted a seed among FERC and I think with the RTOs and ISOs. But they've been thinking about this. I mean, if you think about how much has been integrated in the grid for the last 10 years, even that much, before the grid study came out, FERC was thinking about how do we integrate all this? How does the grid resolve this? The utilities have been thinking, how do we deal with cybersecurity? How do we deal with infrastructure issues? How do we, support the aging infrastructure of the grid? Then there's just so many components that simplifying it. And I commend FERC for doing this. And actually last night I was like, I wonder who wrote, we were kind of, my husband and I were jogging our brains to see the language of the person that wrote it, because it was so clear, we're complete dorks. I mean, we met there, we got married there, my son went to daycare there. It's kind of...
That's why we invited you on the panel.
It's a whole other conversation. When you said nerds, it's a whole other conversation for us. But I think that it really comes down to the oversimplification of it, but the great implications on many levels. So I think it starts off with get that definition in,
Sure.
and make it, sealed.
Thanks, Aleka. Blair, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'll just add a little, because I think you guys did a great job kind of highlighting the fact that there seems to be this notion that reliability and resilience are very much related, but somehow there's this distinction here that we need to kind of nail down for kind of get the rules of the road. So the way I've been thinking about it is, these reliability metrics, they're really thinking about how does the power system accomplish this objective, deliver power. And we have this opportunity to kind of bridge this gap with this idea of the new resilience metrics that don't just think about getting the power back on, but how getting the power back on affects different parts of the community. So DOE is actually undergoing a 3-year process to try to come up with metrics that both for reliability but also for resilience, and to try to figure out, what would we want to measure when we think about resilience. So I think we can all keep our eye out for some of their thinking. They've come out with a report on their first year effort, where they start to hone in on how a resilience metric would differ from a reliability metric, and it's pretty helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I certainly agree with a lot of what's been said. I'll just add, I guess, to sort of talk about the 8-year-old level simplified term. I mean, in some ways, I kind of think about reliability being what each component needs to operate safely, consistently, and with its intended function. And resilience, I'm reminded of some of the actions that the utilities are trying to take. Resilience to me is, okay, so you have 6 or however many transformers on your part of the grid. If one transformer goes down, that's really bad, but you don't need to have 6 spare transformers. You need to have one, because it's cost prohibitive. And I think that's part of the issue is, well, sure, we can make a super reliable system that never goes down, but none of us would be able to afford to have electricity. Yeah. And that's not where we're going. And that's part of the state's role as economic regulators, is to balance, what is safe, affordable, reliable service. Like, affordable is in there. And so I think I'm encouraged by things where some of the utilities have gotten together and they're trying to have systems where they're sharing resources, and that in an emergency we have, like, they've pulled together and they have a spare transformer. And unfortunately, not everybody's transformers are the same. So it turns out that, one system can't necessarily borrow from another. So that's another component of it. These all grew up organically and now they're connected. Okay, what does that mean? We have to look at what can talk to what and what is the same as something else. And, sometimes differences are actually safer in the cybersecurity world because then you can't attack all of them. But that's a whole other topic. But there's this idea of, okay, what's irreplaceable? How do we manage risk? And so I think that's a big component of resilience, is managing the risk. Like reliability is making sure everything goes on every day, but resilience is about the risk. You look at how probable it is and how devastating it is of an event, and then you manage that.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to see a continued and perhaps greater tension as folks install more solar panels, and their first expectation is that their home system is going to work, or their community solar project or wind project is going to work, but then they still have that expectation that the grid is available and can provide that backup, but maybe not be willing to pay for all of it. I think that's an important part of what we need to think about. With an eye on the clock, I do want to open it up to folks here in the room, for any questions. Trust me, I've got a long list of questions here that I could ask. But if anyone has a question, this is the time where you raise your hand and feel free to ask our panelists. Go ahead. If you don't mind introducing yourself.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks for hosting this event.
Sure.
Appreciate it. I'm Rick Murphy with the American Gas Association. Our members represent the companies that deliver natural gas to most of the homes and businesses across the country. And we've been thinking a lot about the role of the natural gas value chain and how to achieve this objective of enhancing the resilience of the energy system, the broader energy system. David, you mentioned a few times about the importance of the integration of natural gas and electric, the interdependencies there, and also mentioned about potential solutions of microgrids and CHP, many of which actually depend on natural gas to operate. So we're thinking about how do we ensure that those solutions are in fact long-term solutions. But I didn't hear much from the other panelists as to this discussion around the broader energy system and natural gas distribution systems. And I was curious if any of that has been brought up, because we are seriously looking at what we need to do to play our part in enhancing the resilience of the overall energy system. So, broad question, but just curious as to, in your discussions, in your forums, are you experiencing any discussions about the role of natural gas?
Sure. Thanks, Rick. Does anybody want to jump first at that? Have we thought?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, natural gas is a huge part of the discussion, and NARUC certainly talks a lot about natural gas. We have a gas committee. We recently did we had a task force that looked at natural gas expansion and looking at, where is the gas? How is this, how is this being used as a resource? And I certainly think that that's a big part of the discussion for distributed energy resources as we start looking at that. Gas is important to support some of the renewable resources in terms of fast start and ramping and such. So, I think it's certainly part of it. Our members have a role with regard to natural gas for, setting rates for distribution, but also for safety, for pipeline safety. So we're very concerned about the safety of the system and what that means. And sometimes that's, what does that mean for resilience? And if something goes down, how much of, where is the rest of the community going to be if, depending on how it's structured?
Thanks, Jennifer.
Just do a quick follow-up. First of all, the question is music to my ears. It's something that we think a lot about. We're blessed with this extraordinarily reliable natural gas system, obviously, but there's also built into that, I think, among many folks, not just state folks, that the assumption that it'll always be there. And I think, that's never a good, way to go into thinking about critical infrastructure. But I think the other thing that we've seen come up in this area is exactly what you pointed out, where we have, whether it's Ohio State University, turning over effectively their energy system for the next 99 years for gas, electric, et cetera, as one provider. They're basically, sort of split off, if you will, from their system as entities, large and small, but large in particular, become more dependent upon that and presume a certain level of reliability. I think we also have to think about how natural gas is used. Most of the governor's energy policy plans that came out in the last 4 or 5 years, South Carolina, Iowa, Utah, are calling for expanded access to natural gas for rural economic development, but also to ensure that the system and the costs to maintain it are borne fairly. And I think as we have more and more natural gas generation, the reliability and the integration of that, to me, seems to be maybe the biggest thing to monitor and to focus on. I think that's the holistic part of this that's important, and I didn't see enough of that, frankly, in some of the discussions around the grid reliability study. It was certainly addressed, but I still am concerned in the cybersecurity discussions we're having on the Hill, that we're having a number with our states. It sort of stops at the electric system, and I'm concerned that there's just this assumption it'll be on the gas side, which is, fortunately has been true, but maybe a bad assumption to plan from.
Thanks, David. Blair, you want to jump in?
I'll just add, I think FERC really signaled when it threw its next proceeding out to the ISOs and the RTOs that some issues of resilience are going to be region specific. And so when we think about threats facing the West, we think about wildfires and we think about droughts. When we think about threats facing the Gulf Coast, we're thinking about hurricanes. And I think in New England in the winter months, we do think about gas transportation constraints. And so I'm going to look to the comments coming in to see if these issues of gas transportation come up in the New England ISO comments.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from the audience here? We'll go right here in the front.
My name's Angel. I'm an electrician, so I'm definitely on the load side when it comes to things. Two questions that I've noticed, especially on the local level. So you have the states who put out different policies. They're looking at 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Especially when it comes to the incentives that states give to the commercial, to the industry, to say if you invest in this renewable energy, you get incentives. And the industries are kind of like, oh, well, it makes sense to go ahead and put solar on because we're getting this incentive. It doesn't necessarily, when you put in resiliency into that equation, it doesn't necessarily add up. How do you get these solar systems in place, or you get the wind systems in place? So how do you create incentives? Because that's how you get the commercial market to change. How do you create incentives that actually create the resiliency? On the other note, too, this goes to the utilities themselves, to the ISOs. The pricing model, where every time they have to justify how are they going to be, and I guess it's kind of a broader issue, how do they end up remaining competitive in the market and not having independent power producers or other entities coming in and kind of like undermining the grid, saying we're going to come in and we're going to do this, and they're below the regulation. They're not even being monitored. You guys got a lot on your plate already. So that's it. So more opening up the incentives, and I'll speak to the natural gas because I live in Maryland. Renewable energy doesn't include anything on the if there's natural gas efficiencies, or if there's other, I'll call it like odd technologies, but that increase efficiency or help with resiliency. Those are not written into the policies right now.
Sure. So ideas on incentives that would help.
I can take, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, but just really quick, with respect to incentives, and when I was talking a little bit about Order 1000, I mean, at that point, there was incentives for building infrastructure. So you got everything from technologies to some other incentives to be able to get some points from a utility perspective on your ROI, so you could continue that growth outside of just the formula rates. I think that with resiliency and reliability, what we're hearing is so many of the issues are on the distribution side, is that I think that part of that conversation on the RTO ISO side, working with the states to create those incentives to provide those. And I'm not going to speak. I mean, that's something that you folks are probably already having conversations on, and you can expand upon it. But I know that those when I did work for the utilities, those incentives that came as a result of the Policy Act for grid infrastructure really helped build. I mean, it was something that they had a close eye on. And so how that translates now, and that's focused primarily on transmission planning, how that translates now in reliability and resiliency, outside of just if it doesn't work on the reliability and you get penalties, that's maybe other folks in the panel, but just wanted to put that in there.
Sure. Thanks, Alexa. Does anybody else want to jump in on incentives? Otherwise, we can.
Sorry, I won't jump in on incentives, but I just want to, one comment you made that I thought is very insightful. In addition to that is the sort of other loads that keep emerging. Again, keeping that 20 to 30-year lens. We have a lot of things that some people think are outliers that certainly aren't, and they range from the fairly obvious of electric vehicles and transportation and the kind of grid cost-benefit analyses that that Jennifer's members are going to have to deal with, and that many of the governors are promoting or incentivizing, whether through maybe not financially, but in terms of policy leadership. The other place that we see that emerging, unexpected load or unexpected lack of load are in the building environment. We have not, for 4 miles from where we're sitting, the first zero energy school in this part of the country, where the school in Arlington produces more electricity and energy overall than it consumes. We had the first 3 schools like that in the country in Kentucky 7 years ago. How do they, what do they pay for? What are their reliability expectations? That's a microcosm, maybe nano. It's that small in a way because it's a small piece of the market. But those are the kind of things that regulators I think are going to be increasingly challenged with dealing with. Is how do you treat those folks fairly and everybody else that frankly are going to have not much need for the grid on a day-to-day basis in terms of reliability. And I think that's something we have to begin thinking about planning for. It is obviously a ways in the future, but we will overbuild our system if we don't take that into account. So I think your observation is particularly good.
Great, thanks, David. I think we've got time for just one more question. Go ahead.
I'm Terry Hill. I'm with the Passive House Institute and the eMerge Alliance.
Okay.
Put two together, very energy efficient building and direct current. Solar produces direct current, batteries use direct current. Anything within the house with electronics in it uses direct current. But nobody's really put the two together. And it gets back to what you just said about the net zero houses. There are, 700, how many buildings are in the country that could be retrofitted to reduce that energy pollution? So nobody's really talking about the load.
5.6 million commercial buildings.
Exactly. So, there's tremendous opportunity to reduce the load, period. So is anybody looking at taking a clean slate approach to a new design of the 21st century grid and laying that out, and how would that impact all the multiple decisions that are about to be made to put patches on the existing grid?
Sure. That's a good question. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. That might be a good segue to our next panel, though. Let's make that our segue to the next panel. And I think that this has been an important conversation, and I do want to thank you for each of our panelists here. This is a complicated problem to solve in terms of, number one, defining resiliency, and number two, identifying what the metrics are that we're going to use when looking at this. And the keep it simple approach, that the DOE proposed in terms of, we can measure a pile of coal and we can see that there's some resiliency with some of these systems. The era that we're in with distributed generation and increasingly renewable technologies being deployed nearly everywhere really changes that dynamic. And so it's been helpful to hear, what has worked, at the state level, and then really the focus in terms of some of those metrics might need to be outcome oriented in terms of maintaining critical infrastructure and those resources in place so that the rest of the system can reboot. So a brief round of applause for our panelists here. We'll take just a 5-minute break to transition to the next group. Thank you all.